Rome, 1972. The set of Way of the Dragon looked calm on the surface, but beneath it, tension was quietly forming. Bruce Lee wasn't just starring in this film, he was directing it, choreographing it, and shaping every fight scene with obsessive precision. This project mattered deeply to him. It was the first time he had full creative control, the first time he could show exactly what he believed martial arts on screen should be. Not exaggerated, not theatrical. Efficient, honest, and uncompromising. Chuck Norris arrived as a guest star with a very different background. At that point, he was already a well-known karate champion in the United States, a multiple-time world title holder, respected in tournament circles for his discipline, power, and textbook technique. He had worked with actors before, trained them, corrected their form. From his perspective, this was another movie job. Bruce Lee, to him, was an impressive on-screen performer. Fast, intense, charismatic, but still, fundamentally, an actor playing a fighter. During early rehearsals, Chuck watched Bruce demonstrate movements for the final fight scene. The footwork was unfamiliar. The angles were unconventional. There were no traditional stances, no clear karate structure. Bruce emphasized distance control, timing, and interception rather than power or form. Chuck listened politely, nodded, but inwardly questioned it. In his world, champions were built through rules, rounds, and judges. What Bruce was showing looked effective on film, but Chuck wasn't convinced it would hold up against a trained fighter who didn't play by cinematic rhythms. That quiet doubt showed itself in small ways: slight hesitation during rehearsals, a subtle stiffness in exchanges. Bruce noticed immediately. He always did. He understood that respect couldn't be requested. It had to be earned, especially from someone who had proven himself in real competition. And Bruce had no intention of forcing belief through words. By the end of that first rehearsal day, the gap between perception and reality was still wide. Chuck Norris believed Bruce Lee was talented, fast, even brilliant for cinema. It simply didn't believe he was dealing with someone operating on an entirely different level of understanding. That realization hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. There are many more Bruce Lee stories and lessons still waiting to be discovered. The following days on set deepened the quiet tension between them. Rehearsals moved from broad choreography into finer details, where Bruce Lee's approach became impossible to ignore. He adjusted distances by inches, insisted on movements that looked almost unfinished until the final instant, and demanded absolute control from both himself and Chuck Norris. Bruce wasn't interested in making the fight look dramatic through big motions. He wanted it to feel inevitable, like a real confrontation unfolding without wasted effort. Chuck followed the directions, but his instincts kept pulling him back toward structured form. Clean lines and familiar rhythms drilled into him through years of competitive karate. At one point during a rehearsal break, Chuck casually mentioned that certain movements would never be allowed in tournament combat. Bruce listened without interrupting, then calmly replied that tournaments weren't fights, and films shouldn't pretend they were. He explained that real combat had no judges, no rounds, and no agreement on what was allowed. Timing, adaptability, and intent mattered more than form. Chuck didn't argue, but he wasn't convinced either. From his perspective, discipline and proven systems created champions. Bruce's method felt too fluid, too undefined, almost improvisational. Bruce sensed the skepticism, and instead of addressing it directly, he invited Chuck to stay after rehearsal one evening. No cameras, no crew. Just an empty section of the Coliseum set as the sun dropped and the noise of production faded away. Bruce suggested they move lightly, not to spar, not to fight, but to feel distance and reaction. Chuck agreed, confident but curious, assuming this would simply confirm what he already believed, that Bruce was extraordinary on screen, but not fundamentally different from other skilled martial artists he'd encountered. They began slowly. Chuck tested range with controlled movements, probing with the precision of a seasoned competitor. Bruce remained relaxed, hands low, posture loose, eyes locked not on Chuck's body, but on his center. When Chuck stepped in, Bruce was already gone, shifting just enough to stay unreachable. There was no rush, no display, no force, just absence where contact was expected. Chuck tried again, increasing speed slightly, adjusting angles, relying on timing that had beaten countless opponents before. Each attempt ended the same way. Bruce was never where Chuck aimed. And worse, Bruce was always close enough to counter if he chose to. Chuck felt it before he fully understood it. A growing realization that he wasn't being challenged in the usual way. He wasn't being blocked or overpowered. He was being read. That was the moment the doubt started to crack. Chuck paused, lowering his guard slightly, not out of fatigue but confusion. This wasn't how exchanges usually unfolded. There was no collision of techniques, no clash of strength against strength. Every time he initiated movement, Bruce seemed to arrive at the conclusion before the action itself had fully formed. Chuck realized that Bruce wasn't reacting in the conventional sense. He was intercepting intention. Years of competition had trained Chuck to read visible cues, shoulders turning, hips loading, breath tightening. Bruce operated earlier than that, responding to balance shifts so small they barely registered consciously. Bruce suggested increasing the pace. Not aggressive, not full power, just faster transitions. Chuck nodded and committed more fully this time, trusting his instincts and experience. The distance closed quickly, but again Bruce slipped just outside the line of attack. His movements economical to the point of invisibility. A hand appeared near Chuck's chest, stopping short. Then near his shoulder. Then close to his jaw. No contact, no force. Just unmistakable placement. Each position made the same statement. This could have ended already. Chuck felt an unfamiliar sensation settle in. It wasn't fear. It was something more unsettling. The recognition that none of his usual tools were reaching their target. His size, his power, his tournament-honed speed weren't being challenged head-on. They were being bypassed. Bruce wasn't trying to defeat him. He was demonstrating a different operating system altogether. Bruce finally stopped and spoke quietly, explaining that fighting wasn't about trading techniques, but controlling space and time. He talked about rhythm, about breaking expectation, about how the fastest strike was the one launched before the opponent realized a decision had been made. He explained that most fighters train to win exchanges, while he trained to prevent them from ever forming. Chuck listened closely now, not as a guest star, not as a champion, but as a student encountering something genuinely new. The silence between them stretched. Chuck nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. He understood then why Bruce had been so exacting during rehearsals, why he insisted on realism that bordered on discomfort. This wasn't about choreography or ego. It was about truth, and Bruce refused to dilute it, even for cinema. When they returned to the set the next day, something had changed. Chuck followed Bruce's direction without hesitation. The skepticism was gone, replaced by trust. Not blind admiration, but respect earned through first-hand experience. The famous fight scene that audiences would later watch wasn't just acting anymore. It was informed by an understanding that only one of them had possessed when rehearsals began. And Chuck Norris knew it. As filming progressed, the dynamic on set shifted in ways that weren't immediately visible to outsiders. The crew still saw two professionals rehearsing a climactic fight scene, but beneath that surface, a deeper alignment had taken place. Chuck Norris no longer approached the choreography as a performer trying to impose his style. He approached it as a craftsman learning a new language. Bruce adjusted details constantly, not to dominate the scene, but to strip it down to its most honest form. Every movement had a reason, every pause had intention. If something looked impressive but lacked purpose, Bruce removed it without hesitation. Chuck began to notice how exhausting Bruce's precision really was. There was no room to coast, no moment where attention could drift. Bruce demanded total presence, not just physically, but mentally. He explained that real combat punished distraction instantly, and cinema should reflect that truth, even if audiences didn't consciously realize it. The goal wasn't to show power, The goal was to show inevitability. Chuck absorbed this philosophy slowly, recognizing that it challenged the very foundation of how he had been trained to think about fighting. Between takes, conversations became quieter, more thoughtful. Chuck asked questions not about techniques, but about principles, distance, timing, emotional control under pressure. Bruce explained that anger slowed people down, that ego made fighters predictable, and that adaptability mattered more than any single style. He spoke about his belief that martial arts should evolve constantly, shaped by reality rather than tradition. Chuck, who had built his career inside structured systems, began to see the limitations of rigid frameworks when removed from controlled environments. When cameras rolled again, the difference was undeniable. The final fight scene carried a tension that couldn't be rehearsed into existence. It felt restrained, dangerous, and personal. Chuck's movements became tighter, more responsive. Bruce's presence filled the space without excess motion. What audiences would later see as one of the greatest fight scenes in film history was born not from rivalry, but from a quiet transfer of understanding that happened far away from the spotlight. By the time filming neared completion, Chuck no longer saw Bruce Lee as an actor who fought well. He saw him as something far rarer, a martial artist whose depth extended beyond rules, styles, and titles. Someone who had dismantled assumptions without ever raising his voice or needing to prove anything publicly. The respect that formed between them wasn't spoken often, but it was absolute. Only one block remained to close that realization. When Way of the Dragon wrapped, the transformation was complete, not just in the footage, but in how Chuck Norris viewed Bruce Lee and, more importantly, how he viewed martial arts itself. The experience hadn't humiliated him, hadn't diminished his achievements as a champion. Instead, it exposed a layer of combat understanding he had never been forced to confront before. Chuck realized that everything he had mastered worked exceptionally well inside defined structures, but Bruce operated outside of structure entirely. Bruce didn't wait for engagement. He shaped it. He didn't react to threats. He removed them before they fully existed. Years later, Chuck would speak openly about that realization. He would explain that Bruce Lee was unlike anyone he had ever trained with, not because of raw strength or speed alone, but because of his ability to read people, to dismantle intention, and to move without broadcasting his decisions. Chuck understood that what Bruce brought into cinema wasn't exaggeration. It was restraint. The realism audiences felt wasn't created by violence, but by control so refined it looked almost unreal. The famous Coliseum fight became legendary not because one man defeated another, but because it represented something rare. Two elite martial artists meeting at different points on the same path. One had mastered the rules. The other had moved beyond them. Chuck Norris didn't lose respect that day. He gained clarity. He saw that mastery wasn't about dominance, trophies, or proving superiority. It was about understanding movement, human behavior, and oneself at the deepest level. Bruce Lee never claimed victory. He never framed the experience as a lesson he imposed. He simply continued doing what he always did, refining truth through movement, stripping away illusion, and letting results speak without explanation. That quiet certainty left a lasting mark on everyone who worked with him, including a man who would go on to become a legend in his own right. The silence that followed those moments wasn't awkward. It was reverent. It was the sound of certainty replacing doubt. And for Chuck Norris, it was the moment he understood that Bruce Lee wasn't performing mastery for the camera, he was living it. Whether anyone was watching or not,